Welcome to the Sealed Room. Before we begin tonight's story, I'd like to ask you to share something with me in the comments below. Tell me where you're listening from, your city, your country, what time of day it is as these words reach you. There's something powerful about knowing that voices from the past can find us wherever we are, whenever we need to hear them. If this story moves you, please consider subscribing and leaving a like. Not as an obligation, but as a small way of ensuring these hidden histories continue to find new ears, new hearts that need to hear them. Tonight, we uncover the story of a young woman whose patience became her weapon, whose silence carved deeper than any blade ever could. This is the tale of Adaeze, and how the dead can speak through the living when justice moves like water through stone, slow, certain, and impossible to stop. Now pay close attention as we begin, in the suffocating heat of a Saint-Domingue morning, where the air itself seemed to carry the weight of unspoken names. Act 1. The wound that would not heal. The sugar mill's grinding wheel turned with the regularity of a heartbeat, but Adaeze had learned to hear the spaces between the sounds, the moments when the overseer's attention drifted, when his eyes moved toward the shade, when death could slip past unnoticed. She stood at her assigned station, hands moving through the motions of feeding cane stalks into the crushing mechanism. But her mind traveled elsewhere, always elsewhere, to a village compound in Dahomey where her mother's loom had clicked with the same steady rhythm, where her father's voice had carried across the courtyard at dawn, calling the workers to begin another day. The cloth tucked beneath her shift rustled against her skin with each movement. Such a small thing, a strip of indigo-dyed cotton no larger than her palm, its edges frayed now from 2 years of hiding, 2 years of carrying the last piece of home against her heart. Her mother had pressed it into her hands during those final chaotic moments when the rival warriors had broken through their village defenses, when everything familiar had become smoke and screaming and the terrible sound of families being torn apart like wet cloth. "Keep your mind on the work, girl." The voice cracked across her thoughts like a whip that had found its target. Adaeze's hands never faltered, never betrayed the way her spine had gone rigid, but she felt the familiar cold settle in her chest. Not fear. She had burned through fear long ago. Something else. Something patient. Overseer Dubois stood 3 paces away, his pale eyes scanning the line of workers with the same expression she had seen on her father's face when counting livestock. The comparison wasn't accidental. Here, on the Chateau Bowmont plantation, the distinction had been made explicitly clear from her first day. She was inventory. Item number 247 in Master Bowmont's ledger, recorded between a milk cow and a broken plow that needed repair. The morning light slanted through the mill's open sides, carrying with it the perpetual sweetness that clung to everything on a sugar plantation. The sweetness that made her stomach turn because it meant wealth built on ground-down bones, because it meant the white gold that filled French ships while filling French graves. Dubois moved on, his attention caught by some minor infraction further down the line. Adaeze felt the collective exhale of relief, so slight it could have been the wind, but she knew better. Every person in this mill lived in the spaces between breaths, in the moments when violence wasn't actively falling on their shoulders. She fed another stalk into the grinding mechanism and let her eyes drift toward the plantation house visible through the mill's eastern opening. 3 stories of white-painted wood and wraparound galleries, designed to catch every breeze while the workers below baked in the heat. Master Bowmont would be taking his morning coffee on the upper gallery about now, reviewing his account books with the same mechanical precision he brought to everything else. Adaeze had seen those books, had been inside that house, in fact, during her first week on the plantation when she'd been selected for domestic duty, a privilege that lasted exactly 4 days, until the night she'd stood frozen in the hallway outside Master Bowmont's study and watched through the cracked door as he recorded her father's death. The memory arrived without warning, as it always did. No gradual approach, no chance to prepare. One moment she was feeding cane stalks to the grinder, and the next she was 17 again, newly arrived on a ship that reeked of death and desperation, watching her father struggle to his feet as the overseer dragged a woman toward the plantation house. She had never learned the woman's name. That was the detail that haunted her most. Not her father's blood soaking into the dirt. Not the casual way Master Bowmont had lowered his pistol. Not even the sound her mother had made when the news reached the quarters. It was the namelessness of it all. The woman had been someone's daughter, someone's sister, someone's reason for breathing, and now she existed only as the cause of her father's death, reduced to a catalyst for violence. Her father had stepped forward when the woman began to scream. That was all. Not a threat, not an attack, just a step forward, one hand raised, his voice carrying the authority he'd once used to settle disputes in their village. Please. She is frightened. Master Bowmont had shot him in the chest without a word of warning. The mill wheel ground on, its rhythm unchanged, but Adaeze felt her breathing shift into the pattern she'd developed over these 2 years. Slow inhale through the nose, hold for 3 counts, exhale through slightly parted lips. The technique had kept her alive through the voyage, through the auction block, through nights when grief threatened to tear her throat open with screaming. She glanced toward the plantation house again, noting the routine she'd observed every day for 24 months. Master Bowmont would finish his coffee and account books, then make his morning inspection of the fields. He walked the same route every day, checking the same locations, pausing at the same spots where he could observe the maximum number of workers with minimum effort. A creature of habit. It was the first thing she'd noticed about him, back when noticing such things had been about survival rather than planning. The sun climbed higher, and with it the temperature inside the mill. Sweat ran down her spine, pooling at the base of her back where the indigo cloth lay hidden. The fabric had absorbed so much salt over these years that it had taken on the taste of her skin, becoming part of her in a way that went beyond the physical. It was proof that she had existed before this place, before these numbers and ledgers and the reduction of human souls to inventory items. Water break! Dubois' call sent a ripple of relief through the mill. Workers stepped back from their stations, wiping sweat-slicked hands on their clothes, some stretching backs that had been bent over machinery since before dawn. Adaeze moved with the crowd toward the water barrels, but her attention remained on the plantation house. Right on schedule, Master Bowmont appeared on the gallery, his coffee cup in one hand and a leather portfolio in the other. Even at this distance, she could make out his precise movements. Everything about the man was measured, calculated, reduced to its most efficient form. He was 42 years old, had inherited the plantation from his father, and believed that the key to profitable sugar production lay in what he called systematic management of human resources. She had heard him explain his philosophy to a visiting merchant one evening, standing in the same hallway where she'd watched him record her father's death. People were like machinery, he'd said. They required maintenance, fuel, and careful monitoring, but when properly managed, they could produce remarkable results. The trick was never to confuse them with actual human beings. That led to sentimental mistakes that hurt profitability. The merchant had complimented him on his modern thinking. Adaeze dipped her cup into the water barrel and drank slowly, letting the lukewarm liquid settle her stomach. Around her, other workers did the same, some whispering in combinations of languages that had evolved in the quarters. French mixed with various African tongues, Spanish borrowed from traders, English picked up from sailors. A communication system that belonged to no master, no overseer, no colonial power. She recognized most of the voices now. 2 years was long enough to learn who could be trusted with a confidence, who would share the last of their rice when someone fell sick, who would cover for you when grief made work impossible. It was also long enough to identify those who had informed to gain favor, who had broken under the weight of their circumstances and chosen survival over solidarity. Marie stood 3 people over, filling her own cup with hands that still shook slightly from the fever that had nearly killed her last month. She was from the Wolof people, had been a trader's daughter before capture, and possessed a mind for numbers that rivaled any European merchants. She was also one of the few people who knew about the cloth hidden beneath Adaeze's shift, and the significance it held. Their eyes met briefly over the water barrels. Marie's face revealed nothing, but she touched her left shoulder with her free hand, a gesture that could have meant anything to an observer. But to Adaeze meant, I see you, I am here. Such small rebellions, such necessary ones. The water break ended with Dubois' sharp whistle, and the mill returned to its grinding rhythm. Adaeze resumed her position, hands moving through the familiar motions while her mind continued its work. Planning required information, and information required patience. She had both in abundance now. Master Bowmont completed his gallery ritual and began his descent toward the fields. His route would take him past the mill's eastern side in approximately 12 minutes. He would pause there, clipboard in hand, making notations about productivity and worker behavior. He would stand in the same spot he'd occupied yesterday and every day before that, believing himself to be observing while remaining completely unaware of how thoroughly he was being observed in return. The grinding wheel turned. The sugar cane fed through the mechanism with mechanical precision. And Adaeze continued her own form of systematic management, cataloging details that would prove useful when the time finally came to balance the books. That time was approaching. She could feel it in the way the seasons were changing, in the quality of light that meant the harvest would soon be complete, in the subtle shift of routine that occurred when one cycle ended and another began. Master Bowmont's predictability, which had once been a tool for her survival, was about to become the instrument of his reckoning. The indigo cloth rustled against her skin, and for just a moment, she heard her mother's voice as clearly as if she stood beside the grinding wheel. Patience, daughter. The ancestors see everything, they remember everything, and they never, never forget. Neither would she. Act 2. The Architecture of Silence. The slave quarters occupied a section of the plantation that Master Bowmont's architectural plans had designated as auxiliary housing for human resources. 2 rows of wooden structures, each building designed to house 20 people, in conditions that prioritized maximum occupancy over comfort, privacy, or dignity. Adaeze had learned to think of her assigned space, a corner section she shared with 3 other women, not as home, but as a place where she could safely access her memories. Night was the only time that belonged to them. After the last bell, when the overseers retreated to their own quarters and the plantation settled into its evening routines, the quarters became something else. Not free, never free, but temporarily unobserved. Voices could be lowered into conversations that mattered. Plans could be whispered. Stories from before could be shared like precious food. Adaeze sat cross-legged on her straw mattress, the indigo cloth spread across her palm like a map of a country that no longer existed. The fabric's edges had grown soft with handling, its color faded but still holding traces of the deep blue that had once marked it as her mother's finest weaving. Under the dim light of a single oil lamp shared among the 4 women, she could make out the pattern worked into the cotton, geometric designs that told the story of her family line, reaching back through generations of women whose names she could still recite from memory. "You're thinking too loud again," Marie said from her own mattress. The fever had left her thinner than before, her cheekbones sharp in the lamplight, but her mind remained as precise as ever. Thoughts like yours have a sound, dangerous sound. Adaeze folded the cloth and tucked it back against her skin. What sound is that? Like water finding new channels, like root systems growing where they shouldn't. Marie shifted position, wincing slightly from the lingering effects of her illness. I've heard it before, in my father's trading house, when merchants came with information about wars brewing in distant kingdoms. They would speak of business, of trade routes, but underneath their words was this same sound. Planning, calculation, the music of things about to change. The third woman on their side of the building, Celeste from Martinique, looked up from the shirt she was mending by lamplight. Change comes whether we plan for it or not. Question is whether we meet it prepared or let it happen to us. Celeste had been on the plantation longer than any of them, nearly 7 years. She'd survived 2 overseers, 3 harsh seasons, and the kind of brutalities that would have broken most people twice over. Her survival had required a different kind of planning than what occupied Adaeze's thoughts, but planning nonetheless. She knew which guards could be charmed into small kindnesses, which days to avoid the fields entirely by claiming illness, how to move through the plantation's routines while remaining essentially invisible. The fourth member of their small community was Esperanza, barely 16 and still raw with the trauma of recent separation from her family in Cuba. She rarely spoke during these evening conversations, but Adaeze had noticed how carefully she listened, filing away information about survival on a plantation that operated by rules she was still learning. "There's talk in the fields," Celeste said, her voice pitched low even though they were alone, "about ships coming more frequently to Port-au-Prince. French merchants, but also others, Spanish, English, even some American traders." Marie's attention sharpened. "What kind of talk?" "The kind that means change coming whether we want it or not. Revolution brewing in France, problems with the Spanish colonies, unrest spreading through the islands. Masters getting nervous about keeping their property secure." Adaeze absorbed this information while maintaining her expression of casual interest. Political instability among the colonial powers could create opportunities, but it could also mean increased restrictions, harsher punishments, a general tightening of control that would make any form of resistance more dangerous. "Dubois has been meeting with riders from other plantations," she said, contributing her own piece of intelligence. "Men who don't stay for meals or overnight lodging. Quick conversations, then they leave immediately." "Coordination," Marie said immediately. "When planters start talking to each other more frequently, it means they're worried about something that affects all of them." The lamp's flame guttered slightly in a draft, casting moving shadows across their faces. For a moment, Adaeze could see them as they might have been in other circumstances. Marie as a merchant negotiating trade agreements, Celeste as a village elder mediating disputes, Esperanza as a young woman learning the skills that would carry her family's traditions forward. Instead, they were inventory items housed in auxiliary structures, their capabilities reduced to labor productivity and their worth measured in colonial currency. The injustice of it settled in her chest like a physical weight, but she had learned to transform that feeling into something more useful than rage. Rage burned too quickly, consumed itself in explosive moments that changed nothing and left the rager more vulnerable than before. What she cultivated instead was something cooler, more sustainable, a patient fury that could wait for the right moment, the perfect opportunity, the chance to act with precision rather than passion. "Esperanza," she said gently, "what news from the house servants?" The youngest woman looked up, startled to be addressed directly. She worked in the kitchens now, a position that offered certain advantages in terms of overhearing conversations and observing the behavior patterns of the plantation's ruling class. "Master Bowmont has been writing many letters," Esperanza said, her French still carrying the musical inflections of her native Spanish. "The housekeeper, she complains about the cost of paper and ink. And there was a man yesterday, well-dressed, who came for private conversation." "They spoke for 2 hours in the study. Did you hear any of their conversation?" "Some words. Talk of insurance, of protecting investments. The visitor, he used a word I did not know. Contingencies. Master Bowmont, he was very interested in this word." Marie and Adaeze exchanged glances. Insurance and contingencies suggested that Master Bowmont was preparing for potential disruptions to his operation. That could mean anything from natural disasters to slave uprisings to political changes that might affect the profitability of sugar production. "There's something else," Esperanza continued, her voice dropping even lower. "In the study, there are new ledger books. Not just the regular plantation records, but books with different kinds of information. Lists of names, but also descriptions. Physical descriptions like what you might write if you wanted to find someone who had run away. The implication settled over them like a cold wind. Detailed physical descriptions of enslaved people could serve multiple purposes, but in the current political climate, they most likely represented preparation for a systematic hunt if any significant number of people attempted to escape. How detailed? Adaeze asked. Very detailed. Height, weight, distinguishing marks, even notes about personality and skills. I saw my own entry when I was cleaning. They know things about us that we never told them. The observation reminded Adaeze of something she'd been considering for months, the extent to which they were surveilled even when they believed themselves to be unobserved. Master Bowmont's systematic approach to plantation management included systematic intelligence gathering about his human property. He knew their relationships, their capabilities, their potential for resistance. He had been preparing for contingencies long before any external political pressures made such preparations seem necessary. The lamp flame steadied, and the shadows on the walls resumed their normal patterns. Around them, the quarters had settled into the deeper quiet of night, punctuated occasionally by someone coughing, a child whimpering in sleep, the creak of wooden structures settling in the cooling air. "We need to be more careful about information," Marie said finally. "If they're documenting things we thought were private, then they're watching more closely than we realized." "Or they have informants among us," Celeste added grimly. The possibility had occurred to all of them at various times, but speaking it aloud gave it a weight that made the small space feel suddenly less secure. If someone in the quarters was reporting to the overseers or directly to Master Bowmont, then any planning, any resistance, any attempt to support each other became exponentially more dangerous. Adaeze pulled her knees up to her chest, a position that pressed the indigo cloth more firmly against her heart. The fabric seemed to hold warmth independently of her body temperature, as if it carried some essential heat from the hands that had woven it, from the village compound where it had been made, from the life she'd lived before becoming item number 247. "What if there's no informant?" she said slowly. "What if Master Bowmont is simply better at observation than we've given him credit for?" The others considered this possibility. It was almost more disturbing than the idea of betrayal from within their own community, because it suggested a level of systematic surveillance that left no space for the small freedoms they'd carved out through careful planning and mutual support. "Either way," Marie said, "we proceed more carefully. Smaller conversations, less information shared with anyone we haven't known for years, and we assume that anything we do in daylight is being watched and recorded." Adaeze nodded, but her mind was moving in a different direction. If Master Bowmont was indeed preparing for contingencies, if he was coordinating with other planters, if he was documenting detailed information about every person on the plantation, then he was also revealing his own patterns and priorities. Systematic people were predictable people, and predictable people were vulnerable people. The lamp finally guttered out, leaving them in the familiar darkness that meant the day's planning was complete. Around her, the others settled into sleep with the efficiency of people who had learned to take rest wherever they could find it. But Adaeze remained awake, listening to the night sounds of the plantation, insects in the sugarcane fields, the distant lowing of cattle, the creak of wood expanding and contracting with temperature changes. Somewhere in the plantation house, Master Bowmont was probably also awake, reviewing his ledger books by candlelight, making his own plans for managing contingencies and protecting investments. He was thinking of her as item number 247, a human resource that required systematic management to remain productive and secure. He had no idea that item number 247 was also making plans, was also preparing for contingencies, was also thinking systematically about the most effective ways to protect what mattered most. The indigo cloth rustled softly against her skin as she finally allowed herself to relax into sleep. Tomorrow would bring another day of grinding sugar cane, another day of careful observation, another day of patient preparation for the moment when the books would finally be balanced. That moment was coming closer. She could feel it approaching like a change in weather, like the shift in wind patterns that meant a storm was gathering strength just beyond the horizon. She slept, and in her dreams, her father's voice carried across a village compound at dawn, calling the workers to begin another day. But this time, when the warriors broke through their defenses, she was ready for them. This time, she did not run. Act 3. The Mathematics of Justice. The harvest season brought changes to the plantation's rhythm that Adaeze had learned to read like weather patterns. Longer days in the fields, increased supervision, the kind of focused intensity that turned every day into a test of endurance. But it also brought opportunities for those patient enough to recognize them. Master Bowmont's morning routine had shifted with the season's demands. Instead of lingering over coffee and account books on the gallery, he now began each day with a pre-dawn inspection of the mill, checking machinery that would be running at capacity for the next several weeks. The inspection followed the same pattern every morning: mill first, then the boiling house where raw cane juice was transformed into crystallized sugar, then a walk through the fields to assess the day's cutting prospects. Adaeze had been observing this routine for 3 weeks now, timing each segment down to the minute, noting which workers were positioned where, cataloging the brief moments when Master Bowmont was temporarily isolated from the overseers and guards who usually accompanied him. This morning, she'd arranged to be assigned to cleaning detail in the boiling house, a job that required her to arrive before dawn to prepare the workspace for the day's sugar production. The work was brutal. Temperatures that made the mill seem cool by comparison, air thick with steam and the acrid smell of boiling cane juice, surfaces that needed constant cleaning to prevent the crystallized sugar from building up and interfering with production. But it also positioned her perfectly to observe the second phase of Master Bowmont's inspection routine. She knelt beside one of the massive boiling vats, scraping away the residue from yesterday's production, when she heard his footsteps on the wooden walkway that connected the mill to the boiling house. His pace was measured, deliberate, every step calculated to cover the maximum distance with minimum effort. Even his walking embodied the systematic efficiency he brought to every aspect of plantation management. He appeared in the doorway precisely at 5:47 a.m., the same time he'd appeared every morning for the past 3 weeks. His eyes swept the boiling house interior, taking note of cleanliness levels, equipment condition, worker productivity. When his gaze passed over Adaeze, she kept her attention focused on scraping sugar residue, just another piece of human machinery performing its designated function. "You there," he said, and the words dropped into the humid air like stones into still water. Adaeze looked up, her expression carefully neutral. "Yes, Master Bowmont. Your name?" She had been expecting this question for 2 years, had prepared for the moment when she would move from anonymous inventory item to specifically identified individual. "Adaeze, Master." He produced a small notebook from his jacket pocket and made a notation. His handwriting was precise, economical, each letter formed with the minimum number of strokes necessary to convey information clearly. "You've been working cleaning detail for 3 weeks." "Yes, Master." Previous assignment was the mill. Before that, brief period of domestic service. He wasn't asking questions. He was confirming information he already possessed. The systematic documentation Esperanza had observed was more comprehensive than any of them had realized. "Yes, Master." "The domestic service ended after 4 days. Do you recall why?" The question hung between them like a blade balanced on its edge. Adaeze felt time slow, felt her breathing shift into the pattern she'd developed for moments when everything could be lost or gained by the next word spoken. He knew. The question was how much he knew, and whether her answer would reveal more than it concealed. "I was not suitable for housework, Master." "Elaborate." "I was unfamiliar with the requirements. I made mistakes. Master Bowmont studied her face with the same clinical attention he brought to examining machinery. She kept her expression empty, receptive, slightly apologetic, the look of someone who understood they had failed to meet expectations and accepted that failure as a personal limitation rather than a systematic injustice. "You were found in the hallway outside my study at night," he said, standing, listening. "I was lost, Master. The house is very large. I was trying to find my way back to the servants' quarters." For 20 minutes. The precision of his information was breathtaking. He had timed her presence in that hallway, had somehow monitored her exact location and duration. The implications were staggering. If he possessed this level of detailed surveillance from 2 years ago, what did he know about more recent activities? "I was afraid to move, Master. I thought I might make noise and wake someone. I was waiting for quiet footsteps." It was a plausible explanation, the kind of reasoning that a confused and frightened new arrival might follow. More importantly, it positioned her as someone whose actions were driven by fear and uncertainty, rather than deliberate intelligence gathering. Master Bowmont made another notation in his notebook. "You witnessed a disciplinary action that evening, Master." "My father. The correction administered to the worker who interfered with estate business." The words hit her like physical blows, but she had been preparing for this moment for 2 years. Her face revealed nothing but polite confusion, as if she were trying to recall some minor incident that had occurred to someone else, somewhere else, in circumstances that had no connection to her own experience. "I remember some commotion, Master. I was very frightened. I did not understand what was happening." "The worker who was corrected, what was his relationship to you?" Here was the center of it. The question she'd been dreading and anticipating in equal measure. Master Bowmont knew, had known from the beginning. The real question was whether he understood the implications of what he knew and what he planned to do with that information. Relationship, Master? Family connection, tribal affiliation, previous acquaintance. She let confusion deepen on her face, as if the question itself were difficult to comprehend. "I did not know him, Master. We came on different ships, from different places. I think perhaps he was trying to help someone who reminded him of his own family. But I did not know him." It was a masterful lie because it contained elements of truth. They had come on different ships. Her father had been captured 3 weeks before her own village was raided, and he had been trying to help someone who reminded him of family, his daughter, though Master Bowmont had no way of knowing that the woman being dragged toward the plantation house had been screaming in the same language that Adaeze's mother had sung to her as a child. Master Bowmont closed the notebook and returned it to his pocket. His expression revealed nothing about whether he accepted her explanation or simply decided that her current usefulness as a worker outweighed whatever security concerns he might harbor about her true identity and motivations. "Return to your work," he said. "The boiling house requires attention to detail. Equipment failure here costs money." "Yes, Master." He moved on toward the fields, his footsteps resuming their measured cadence. Adaeze returned to scraping sugar residue from the boiling vat, but her mind was processing the conversation with the intensity of someone whose life had just depended on precisely the right combination of truth and deception. He knew she was her father's daughter, had probably known from the moment she'd arrived on the plantation. The 4-day domestic service assignment hadn't been a privilege or a sign of favor. It had been a test, an opportunity to observe her behavior and assess her potential threat level under controlled conditions. The 20 minutes she'd spent in the hallway hadn't been unobserved. Somehow, he'd been monitoring her movements, timing her presence, evaluating her reactions to witnessing her father's death. Every detail had been catalogued, analyzed, filed away for future reference. Most disturbing of all, he'd referred to her father's intervention as interference with estate business, and his execution as disciplinary action and correction. In Master Bowmont's systematic worldview, Her father's attempt to protect a woman from sexual assault had been nothing more than a productivity problem that required administrative solution. The boiling vat's surface was clean now, but Adaeze continued scraping, using the repetitive motion to steady her thinking. The conversation had revealed crucial information about Master Bowmont's knowledge and surveillance capabilities, but it had also revealed something else: overconfidence. He believed that his systematic management approach had successfully identified and controlled every potential threat. He saw her as someone whose resistance had been broken by fear, whose spirit had been reduced to basic survival instincts. That misperception would be his downfall. The morning progressed through its established routines. Workers arrived for the day's sugar production. The boiling vats heated to precise temperatures. The systematic conversion of raw plant material into colonial wealth began again. Adaeze moved through her assigned tasks while her mind worked on calculations of a different sort. During the midday break, she positioned herself near the edge of the cane fields where she could observe the plantation house without appearing to do so. Master Bowmont had returned from his field inspection and resumed his position on the upper gallery, reviewing paperwork that she now understood represented far more than simple productivity records. Marie appeared beside her, sharing the precious few minutes when they could speak without immediate supervision. "You look like someone who's been having interesting conversations," Marie said quietly. "The most interesting kind. The kind that change everything. Good change or dangerous change? Both." "Always both." Adaeze kept her eyes on the plantation house, noting the way afternoon light reflected off the windows of Master Bowmont's study. "He knows more than we realized. Much more. About you specifically, about all of us, but especially me." She turned to meet Marie's eyes directly. "He knows who my father was, has known since I arrived." Marie absorbed this information with the kind of stillness that meant she was processing implications rather than reacting emotionally. "That means he's been watching you for 2 years, waiting to see what you would do with your grief. And what he's seen is someone who appears broken, someone who has accepted her circumstances and focused on basic survival. Is that what he's seen?" Adaeze smiled, and for the first time in 2 years, the expression reached her eyes. "That's exactly what he's seen, because that's exactly what I wanted him to see." The afternoon bell rang, calling them back to work. As they separated, Marie touched Adaeze's shoulder with the same gesture she'd used at the water barrels, but this time it carried a different message. "I see you. I am here, and I understand that everything is about to change." The boiling house resumed its afternoon rhythms, but Adaeze worked now with a different quality of attention. The systematic observation she'd been conducting for 2 years was finally approaching its conclusion. Master Bowmont's routine was mapped completely. His knowledge and surveillance capabilities were understood. His overconfidence had been confirmed. Most importantly, his greatest weakness had been identified. Master Bowmont believed that systematic management and detailed record-keeping were sufficient to control any situation that might arise. He had reduced human complexity to administrative data, had convinced himself that knowing someone's history and monitoring their behavior was equivalent to understanding their capabilities. He was about to learn the difference between information and wisdom, between surveillance and insight, between systematic management and the kind of justice that moved like water through stone, slow, certain, and impossible to stop. The indigo cloth pressed against her skin, warm with body heat and memory. Tonight, she would begin the final phase of her own systematic management project. Tonight, the real work would begin. Act 3 continued. The gathering storm. The sugar harvest demanded 16-hour days in the fields and mills, but it also created opportunities that only existed during this season of controlled chaos. With every overseer's attention focused on meeting production quotas, with Master Bowmont spending more time reviewing logistics than monitoring individual workers, with the plantation's entire rhythm reorganized around the single priority of converting cane to profit before the weather turned, small things could disappear without notice. a hammer from the tool shed, a length of rope from the mill's maintenance supplies, a bottle that had once contained medicine, now empty and carefully cleaned. Items so mundane that their absence wouldn't be discovered until well after the harvest ended, if it was discovered at all. Adaeze had been selecting and relocating these materials for 6 weeks now, moving with the patience of someone who understood that the most effective plans were built from components so ordinary that they attracted no attention whatsoever. The items were hidden in different locations around the plantation, some buried beneath the floor of an unused storage building, others concealed in the hollow space behind loose boards in the mill's eastern wall, still others secured in the root system of a massive oak tree that stood at the boundary between the cultivated fields and the wild forest beyond. She was returning from one such hiding expedition, moving through the pre-dawn darkness with footsteps that made no sound on the packed dirt paths, when she encountered someone she hadn't expected to find awake at this hour. Sheriff Broussard stood beside the well that served the slave quarters, not drinking water but simply standing in the darkness, his attention focused on the plantation house in the distance. He was a lean man in his 50s, with graying hair and the kind of weathered face that suggested he'd spent more years working outdoors than sitting behind a desk, despite his current position as the colonial authority responsible for maintaining order across 3 plantations in this section of Saint-Domingue. Adaeze froze in the shadow of a storage building, calculating whether she could retreat without being noticed, or whether movement would only draw attention to her presence. Broussard's posture suggested he wasn't just taking air. He was observing, thinking, processing information in the way of someone whose job required him to notice things that others might miss. "Late night or early morning," he said without turning in her direction. There was no point in pretending she wasn't there. "Early morning, sir. I was unable to sleep." Broussard turned to face her, his expression neutral in the dim light that preceded dawn. Insomnia is common during harvest season. Too much heat, too much work, too much change in routine. He spoke French with the accent of someone born in the colonies rather than imported from Europe. Not the refined pronunciation of the planter class, but the practical French of merchants and administrators who had made their lives in the Caribbean. His tone carried no immediate threat, but Adaeze had learned to distrust any conversation with colonial authorities that began with apparent casualness. "Yes, sir." "You work in the boiling house now?" "Yes, sir." "Dangerous work. Easy to be injured if attention wanders." He paused, letting this observation settle between them. Easy for accidents to happen when people are distracted by other concerns. The comment could have been simple workplace safety advice, but something in his delivery suggested deeper meaning. Adaeze maintained her expression of polite attention while her mind worked to decode what he might actually be communicating. "I am very careful, sir." "I'm sure you are. Careful people live longer." Broussard moved closer to the well, running his hand along the stone rim with the casual gesture of someone who was thinking about something else entirely. "Master Bowmont speaks highly of your work ethic." "That is kind of him, sir. He mentioned that you've been particularly stable since your arrival. No disciplinary problems, no attempts at flight, no involvement in any of the small disturbances that sometimes occur in the quarters." Now she understood. This conversation wasn't accidental. Broussard was here deliberately, at this hour, because he wanted to speak with her away from the observation of overseers and other workers. Master Bowmont had mentioned her specifically, and Sheriff Broussard had decided that conversation warranted follow-up investigation. "I try to avoid trouble, sir." "Smart approach. Trouble has a way of spreading from person to person like fever or fire. One small problem becomes a larger problem, then a dangerous problem." He looked directly at her for the first time. "You understand the kind of trouble I mean?" "Sir, unrest, organization, people getting ideas about changing their circumstances through means other than hard work and good behavior." The words hung in the pre-dawn air like a challenge. Sheriff Broussard was fishing for information, trying to determine whether she might be involved in or aware of any resistance activities among the enslaved population. The fact that he was doing so suggested either that such activities existed and he was trying to identify participants, or that he suspected they might be developing and wanted to assess potential threats before they became actual problems. I know only my work, sir, and sleep when I can manage it. Broussard smiled, but it wasn't a pleasant expression. Sleep is a luxury in times of change. These are changing times, you know. Problems in France, problems with trade routes, problems between the colonial powers. When the world above gets unstable, the world below tends to get restless. He was telling her something important, sharing information that she was supposed to interpret and potentially act upon. Political instability in Europe was creating uncertainty in the colonies, and that uncertainty was making colonial authorities nervous about maintaining control over enslaved populations. I hope any problems resolve quickly, sir. So do I, but hoping and preparing are different things. Broussard straightened, his conversation apparently complete. Master Bowmont is a careful man, methodical. He believes in preventing problems before they develop. That seems wise, sir. It is. But prevention requires information. Good information, accurate information, timely information. He paused meaningfully. People who provide such information often find that their circumstances improve. Better work assignments, additional food rations, protection when troubles arise. Now the true purpose of this encounter became clear. Sheriff Broussard was attempting to recruit her as an informant. The casual conversation about insomnia and work assignments had been preliminary assessment. He'd been evaluating her intelligence, her communication skills, her potential usefulness as a source of information about activities in the slave quarters. The offer was simultaneously an opportunity and a trap. Becoming an informant would provide access to information about colonial authorities' concerns and planning, but it would also make her complicit in the surveillance and control of her own community. More dangerously, it would mark her as a collaborator to anyone who discovered her role, effectively cutting her off from the networks of trust and mutual support that made survival possible. That is generous, sir, but I know very little about anything beyond my own work. Perhaps, but people talk around you, trust you with small confidences. Women especially. They share concerns with each other that men might never hear about. Broussard began moving toward the path that led to the plantation house. Think about what I've said. Times are changing, and it's better to change with them than be changed by them. He walked away without waiting for a response, his footsteps deliberate on the packed earth. Adaeze remained beside the storage building until his silhouette disappeared in the direction of the main house, then allowed herself to process what had just occurred. Sheriff Broussard suspected something. Not necessarily her specifically, but something was making him nervous enough to begin recruiting informants from among the enslaved population. The political instability he'd mentioned was real, and it was creating pressure for increased surveillance and control. Most significantly, the timing of this recruitment attempt suggested urgency. If colonial authorities were reaching out to potential informants now, it meant they believed they had limited time before whatever they were concerned about became a more serious problem. The first hint of dawn was appearing on the eastern horizon, and the plantation would be stirring soon. Adaeze made her way back toward the slave quarters, but her route took her past the oak tree at the forest boundary, where some of her gathered materials were hidden. She paused long enough to confirm that nothing had been disturbed, then continued toward the quarters with her mind working on new calculations. Sheriff Broussard's offer changed the timeline. If colonial authorities were actively seeking to increase surveillance, then any action would need to happen before that surveillance network was fully established. The systematic approach she'd been following for 2 years would need to accelerate. She slipped back into the quarters and onto her mattress just as the wake-up bell began ringing across the plantation. Around her, the other women stirred with the weary efficiency of people beginning another day that would demand everything they had to give and offer nothing in return, except the opportunity to do it again. Tomorrow. Marie's eyes met hers across the small space, and Adaeze could see that her friend had noticed her absence. There would be questions, and those questions would require answers that revealed how much everything was accelerating, how close they all were to the moment when careful planning would give way to irreversible action. The indigo cloth rustled against her skin as she rose to begin another day's work in the boiling house. Tonight, she would need to speak with Marie privately. Tonight, she would need to begin sharing the details of what she'd been preparing for 2 years. Tonight, the careful architecture of silence that had protected her planning would need to transform into something else entirely. The first whispered words of a plan that would either free them all or destroy them completely. But first, she would work another day in the boiling house, scraping sugar residue and maintaining the appearance of someone whose spirit had been broken by circumstance. Master Bowmont would make his morning inspection, Sheriff Broussard would continue his investigation, and the plantation would continue its systematic conversion of human suffering into colonial wealth. None of them understood that the most dangerous kind of resistance was the kind that looked exactly like surrender, that moved like water through stone, that accumulated power so gradually that its true force remained hidden until the moment it finally broke through. That moment was coming. Act 4. The execution. The night air carried the heavy sweetness of processed sugar and something else, the electric tension that preceded major storms in the Caribbean. Adaeze stood at the edge of the forest boundary, her hand resting against the bark of the oak tree that concealed the final components of her 2-year preparation. Above her, clouds moved across the stars with unusual speed, suggesting that the weather would change dramatically before morning. Perfect conditions for the kind of work that required darkness and the covering sound of wind through the sugarcane fields. Marie emerged from the tree line behind her, moving with the silent efficiency they'd both developed through months of careful planning. Behind Marie came 2 others, Celeste and a man named Baptiste, who had joined their circle only recently, but whose knowledge of the plantation's physical layout had proved invaluable. Baptiste was originally from Senegal, had been captured while serving as a scout for traders moving between coastal settlements and inland kingdoms. His understanding of terrain, of how to read landscape and weather, of how to move through hostile territory without leaving traces, had made him indispensable once they'd moved beyond theoretical planning into actual preparation. "The house is quiet," Marie reported in a whisper that barely disturbed the air between them. "Master Bowmont retired to his study an hour ago. Same routine as always. Account books until midnight, then sleep. Overseers? Dubois is drunk in his cabin. The others are playing cards in the mill office." Baptiste's voice carried the confidence of someone who had spent weeks mapping the evening routines of everyone in a position of authority. "They'll be occupied until at least 3 in the morning." Adaeze nodded and began retrieving items from their hiding place in the oak's root system. Each component had been selected for maximum effectiveness with minimum detectability. Materials so common on a sugar plantation that their temporary absence would attract no attention, but which could be combined in ways that would serve purposes far beyond their intended use. The rope, carefully cleaned of any fibers that might be traced back to its original location. The hammer, its handle wrapped in strips of cloth to prevent noise and improve grip. The empty medicine bottle, now filled with a mixture that Baptiste had prepared using knowledge gained during his years as a scout. Certain plant materials that grew wild at the forest's edge, combined with other substances that could be found in any plantation's medical supplies. And finally, the piece that would make everything else possible. A key that had been carefully copied from Master Bowmont's ring during one of his boiling house inspections, when his attention had been focused on production quotas and his personal items had been temporarily accessible to someone patient enough to wait for the perfect moment. "You're certain about the timing?" Celeste asked. "I've observed his routine for 2 years. He follows the same pattern every night. Study until midnight, then upstairs to his bedroom. He sleeps deeply, especially during harvest season when the days exhaust even those who don't perform physical labor." Adaeze distributed the materials among the 4 of them, each person taking responsibility for the components they would need for their specific part of the plan. The coordination had been rehearsed dozens of times in whispered conversations, but never as a complete sequence. Tonight would be their only opportunity to discover whether theory translated successfully into practice. "If anything goes wrong," Marie said, "if anyone encounters unexpected resistance or discovers that our intelligence was incorrect, the signal is the nightbird call we've practiced. 2 short sounds, pause, 1 long sound. Anyone who hears that signal abandons their part of the plan immediately and returns to the quarters." They had debated whether to include an abort signal at all. Once they began, retreat might be more dangerous than completion. Partial execution of their plan could leave them exposed to retaliation while accomplishing nothing except their own destruction. But Marie had insisted that they needed a way to respond to unforeseen circumstances, and her argument had proved persuasive. "Remember," Adaeze said, "this isn't about revenge. This is about justice. We do what we came to do. Nothing more, nothing less." The distinction mattered. Revenge was emotional, personal, likely to expand beyond its original targets and create additional problems. Justice was precise, systematic, focused on correcting specific imbalances rather than inflicting maximum damage. The difference between the two approaches would determine whether their actions created meaningful change or simply provided their enemies with justification for increased brutality. They separated, each moving toward their designated starting position. Adaeze took the direct route to the plantation house while the others positioned themselves to handle potential complications or provide distraction if the situation required it. The house stood against the night sky like a monument to the systematic extraction of wealth from human suffering. 3 stories of white-painted wood that gleamed in the starlight, wrap-around galleries designed to catch cooling breezes while the people who created the plantation's prosperity sweltered in windowless quarters. Even the architecture embodied the fundamental injustice that governed every aspect of life in Saint-Domingue. Comfort built directly on top of carefully organized misery. Adaeze approached from the eastern side, where service entrances provided access to the basement storage areas that held household supplies, extra equipment, and the kinds of items that supported a plantation's daily operations without ever being mentioned in the official records. Her copied key fit perfectly into the lock that secured the service door, turning with the smooth precision that indicated Master Bowmont maintained his locks with the same systematic attention he brought to everything else. The basement was familiar territory from her brief period of domestic service 2 years earlier. She moved through the narrow corridors by memory, navigating around stored furniture and supply barrels toward the staircase that led to the main floor. Every step was calculated to avoid the floorboards that creaked. Every movement planned to minimize any sound that might carry to the upper floors where Master Bowmont would be completing his nightly review of account books. The main floor hallway was darker than she remembered, but her eyes had adjusted during the basement navigation. She could make out the familiar doorways: parlor, dining room, kitchen, and at the far end, the study where Master Bowmont conducted the business that reduced human beings to inventory items and human suffering to production costs. Light showed under the study door, confirming that he was maintaining his usual schedule. Adaeze positioned herself in the hallway outside, listening to the familiar sounds that had terrified her 2 years ago, but which now represented the final phase of a plan that had been developing since the night she watched her father die. The scratching of a pen across paper, the occasional rustle of pages being turned. The soft sound of Master Bowmont's breathing as he concentrated on his calculations. All the mundane details of a man who believed himself to be safely in control of his environment, protected by his systematic management approach and comprehensive surveillance of everyone under his authority. He had no idea that his most carefully observed subject had been using that surveillance as a tool for understanding his own patterns and vulnerabilities. Item number 247 had been studying Master Bowmont with the same methodical attention that he had been studying her, and the results of that study were about to be demonstrated. The pen stopped scratching. Papers rustled as account books were closed and stacked for tomorrow's review. Chair legs scraped against wooden floors as Master Bowmont prepared to end his workday and retire upstairs. All exactly according to the schedule that Adaeze had memorized down to the minute. She pressed herself against the wall beside the study door and waited. Master Bowmont emerged precisely at midnight, carrying a candle that cast moving shadows across the hallway walls. His movements were unhurried, methodical, those of a man whose day had proceeded exactly as planned and who anticipated that tomorrow would unfold with the same predictable efficiency. He moved toward the staircase that led to the second floor, his attention focused on the candle flame and the steps ahead of him. Behind him, Adaeze emerged from the shadows and followed at a distance that kept her just beyond the reach of his candlelight. The staircase creaked under his weight, each step producing a small sound that would help mask any noise she might make during her own ascent. She waited until he reached the top of the stairs before beginning her own climb, timing her movements to coincide with his footsteps as he moved down the second-floor hallway toward his bedroom. His bedroom door closed with a soft click. Adaeze remained motionless on the staircase, counting seconds, waiting for the sounds that would indicate he was settling into his nightly routine. Boots removed and placed beside the bed, clothes folded and set on the chair that stood near the window, the creak of mattress springs as he lay down to sleep. Everything proceeded exactly as she had observed during her domestic service, when fear and confusion had made her notice details without understanding their significance. Master Bowmont was a creature of routine, and routine made him predictable, and predictability made him vulnerable. 10 minutes passed. The sounds from the bedroom indicated deep, regular breathing, the sleep of someone whose conscience was untroubled by the systematic brutality that funded his comfortable lifestyle. Adaeze moved up the remaining stairs and along the hallway toward the bedroom door. The copied key worked as perfectly here as it had on the service entrance, turning in the lock with silent precision. She eased the door open just far enough to confirm that Master Bowmont was indeed asleep, then opened it wider and stepped into the room. He lay on his back in the center of a bed that was larger than the sleeping space shared by 4 people in the slave quarters. His breathing was deep and regular, his face relaxed in the expression of someone who had never questioned his right to sleep peacefully, while others lay awake in fear of what tomorrow might bring. Adaeze approached the bed with steps that made no sound on the polished wooden floor. In her hand was the medicine bottle that contained Baptiste's carefully prepared mixture, not enough to kill, but sufficient to ensure that Master Bowmont would sleep more deeply than usual and wake with no memory of the night's events. She uncorked the bottle and held it near his face, allowing the vapor to mix with the air he was breathing. The effect was gradual but unmistakable. His breathing deepened further, and his facial muscles relaxed completely. He would remain unconscious for the next several hours, and when he finally woke, he would assume that his deep sleep had been the result of exhaustion from the harvest season's demands. With Master Bowmont safely unconscious, Adaeze began the real work of the evening. She moved to his dresser, where his personal items were arranged with the same systematic precision he brought to everything else. Wallet, watch, the ring of keys that provided access to every locked space on the plantation. And most importantly, the small leather portfolio that contained his most current records, not the official ledger books that were kept in the study downstairs, but his personal notes about individual enslaved people, including detailed observations about potential security risks and plans for addressing them. She opened the portfolio and began reading by the light of Master Bowmont's bedside candle. Her own entry was there, exactly as she had expected. Item number 247, with extensive notes about her family background, her behavior during domestic service, her current work assignment, and his assessment of her threat level. The assessment was marked minimal, appears broken by circumstances, focused on basic survival, no indication of resistance potential or leadership capability. Adaeze smiled as she read those words. Master Bowmont's systematic approach to human management had led him to exactly the conclusion she had wanted him to reach. By appearing broken, by focusing on basic survival, by showing no obvious signs of resistance or leadership, she had convinced him that she posed no threat to his authority or his plantation's security. He could not have been more wrong. She copied several pages of information onto papers she had brought with her, focusing on entries that revealed Master Bowmont's concerns about other enslaved people and his plans for addressing potential resistance activities. The intelligence would prove invaluable for protecting people who were being monitored or targeted for increased surveillance. When the copying was complete, she returned the portfolio to its exact original position and turned her attention to the final component of the evening's work. From her clothing, she retrieved a folded piece of paper that she had prepared weeks earlier. The message was brief, written in French that was deliberately imperfect, designed to suggest authorship by someone whose education was limited but whose resolve was absolute. The paper contained 3 names. Master Bowmont's name was first, followed by the names of 2 overseers from neighboring plantations, men whose brutality was legendary among the enslaved populations throughout the region. Each name was preceded by a simple phrase, "Justice comes." She placed the paper on Master Bowmont's pillow, positioned so that he would see it immediately upon waking. The message would serve multiple purposes. Proof that his private quarters were not as secure as he believed. Evidence that someone possessed detailed knowledge of his activities and associations, and notice that his systematic management of human resources had been observed and judged by those resources themselves. The paper also contained a 4th element that would not be apparent until Master Bowmont examined it more carefully. Along the bottom edge, almost invisible unless specifically searched for, was a small design worked in ink that matched the geometric patterns woven into the indigo cloth that had once marked her mother's finest weaving. When he eventually noticed that detail, and someone as systematic as Master Bowmont would eventually notice everything, he would understand that item number 247 was not the broken, frightened girl he believed her to be. Her work in the bedroom complete, Adaeze made her way back through the house and out through the service entrance. The entire operation had taken less than an hour, proceeding exactly according to the plan she had been refining for 2 years. Master Bowmont would wake to discover that his private space had been invaded, his security had been compromised, and his assessment of at least one enslaved person had been catastrophically incorrect. But he would wake alive, unharmed, with no permanent damage except to his confidence in his own invulnerability. Justice, not revenge. Precision, not brutality. The kind of action that created fear in oppressors while inspiring hope in the oppressed. Marie was waiting near the oak tree at the forest boundary, her expression tense with concern that transformed into relief when she saw Adaeze approaching. "It's done. It's done, exactly as planned. And Master Bowmont? We'll wake with a message but without injuries. He'll know that someone was in his room, in his personal space, with access to all of his private information. But he'll also know that whoever was there chose not to harm him." They began walking back toward the slave quarters, moving through the pre-dawn darkness with the careful steps of people who understood that their real work was just beginning. What had happened in Master Bowmont's bedroom would change everything. The power balance on the plantation, the level of surveillance and control, the possibilities for resistance, and the dangers that came with it. "He'll increase security," Marie said. "More guards, more restrictions, more surveillance of everyone. Yes, but he'll also be afraid. And fear makes people make mistakes." The first hint of dawn was appearing on the eastern horizon as they slipped back into the slave quarters. Around them, people were beginning to stir for another day's work, unaware that the world had shifted during the night, that the systematic management of human resources was about to become significantly more complicated for those who believed themselves to be the managers. Adaeze settled onto her mattress and felt the indigo cloth against her skin, warm with body heat and memory. For the first time in 2 years, the fabric seemed to pulse with something beyond her own heartbeat, as if her mother's hands, her father's voice, Her village's collective wisdom were acknowledging that the patient work of justice had finally begun. Master Bowmont would wake to discover that item number 247 had been studying him as carefully as he had been studying her. And unlike his analysis, hers had been completely accurate. The reckoning was underway. Act 5. The hunt begins, Master. Bowmont's voice carried across the plantation with the sharp clarity of breaking glass. It was not yet full dawn, but every worker within half a mile of the main house could hear him shouting instructions to the overseers, demanding immediate assembly of all senior staff, calling for Sheriff Broussard to be summoned immediately. Adaeze continued her morning routine with deliberate normalcy, washing from the communal basin, eating the small portion of bread and rice that constituted breakfast, gathering the tools needed for another day in the boiling house. Around her, other workers exchanged glances that conveyed curiosity tempered by wariness. Unusual behavior from Master Bowmont usually meant increased surveillance, arbitrary punishments, disruption of the careful rhythms that made survival possible. None of them knew that the disruption had been precisely calculated to achieve exactly that effect. Something stirred up the master's nest. Celeste observed quietly as they walked toward their work assignments. Haven't heard him this agitated since that merchant tried to shortchange him on last year's sugar prices. Marie fell into step beside Adaeze, her expression carefully neutral. Maybe problems with the harvest quotas, or news from Port-au-Prince about ship schedules. The conversation was for the benefit of anyone who might be listening, plausible explanations that would satisfy casual curiosity, while revealing nothing about the true source of Master Bowmont's distress. But Adaeze could see the deeper communication in Marie's eyes. Are you ready for what comes next? She was. She had been preparing for this moment for 2 years. The boiling house crew assembled at their usual time, but the morning's routine was immediately disrupted by the arrival of Overseer Dubois, with 2 men Adaeze didn't recognize. Plantation guards borrowed from neighboring estates, their presence indicating that Master Bowmont considered the situation serious enough to require additional security. Work proceeds as normal, Dubois announced, but everyone remains at their assigned stations. No movement between work areas without permission, no conversations except those directly related to sugar production. The restrictions were draconian by the standards of normal plantation operations, where workers were generally allowed limited movement and conversation as long as productivity remained acceptable. Implementing such measures suggested that Master Bowmont believed he was dealing with an organized threat that required immediate containment. Adaeze began her assigned tasks while observing the guards' positioning and behavior patterns. They were nervous, uncertain about what they were supposed to be watching for, but committed to appearing vigilant and professional. The kind of heightened security that looked impressive to plantation owners but actually created more vulnerabilities than it prevented. Guards focused on looking busy rather than being effective. Security measures that interfered with normal operations while providing little actual protection. Master Bowmont himself appeared in the boiling house doorway shortly after the morning's work began. His face was pale beneath his usual sun-darkened complexion, and his hands moved with the sharp, controlled gestures of someone fighting to maintain composure. In his right hand was a piece of paper that Adaeze recognized immediately. He surveyed the boiling house interior with eyes that seemed to catalogue every worker, every piece of equipment, every detail that might provide information about how his private quarters had been breached. When his gaze reached Adaeze, it lingered for several seconds, not with suspicion, but with the analytical attention of someone reconsidering previous assessments. "Attention," he said, and the word cut through the humid air like a blade. "Last night, someone entered the main house without permission. Someone with detailed knowledge of the building's layout and access to keys that should have been secure." He paused, allowing this information to settle. Several workers exchanged glances, their expressions showing the mixture of surprise and fear that such news would naturally provoke. Adaeze maintained her focus on scraping sugar residue from the boiling vat, but she could feel Master Bowmont's attention returning to her repeatedly. This person entered my private quarters and left a message, he continued. The message contained information that only someone with extensive observation of plantation operations could have possessed. Another pause. The paper in his hand rustled as his grip tightened. I want to be very clear about what this means. Someone in this room, or someone in the fields, or someone in the quarters, has been conducting surveillance of my activities and planning this violation of plantation security. Someone has been watching, learning, preparing for the right moment to act. His voice carried the controlled fury of someone whose systematic management approach had been revealed as inadequate, whose confidence in his own security measures had been shattered by the simple act of placing a message on his pillow. Sheriff Broussard is conducting a comprehensive investigation. Every person on this plantation will be questioned. Every routine will be examined. Every relationship will be scrutinized. Master Bowmont's eyes swept the room again. Whoever is responsible for this violation will be identified and dealt with according to colonial law. The threat was clear, but so was the underlying admission. Master Bowmont had no idea who was responsible, no immediate suspects, no clear path forward, except broad intimidation and systematic interrogation of everyone under his authority. He left without dismissing the additional guards, who remained positioned at the boiling house entrances like sentries guarding a military installation. The normal rhythms of sugar production resumed, but under conditions that felt more like martial law than agricultural work. During the midday break, Adaeze positioned herself where she could observe the main house without appearing to do so. Sheriff Broussard had arrived with 4 additional men, colonial militia rather than plantation guards, their uniforms and weapons indicating that the investigation was being treated as a serious criminal matter rather than a routine plantation security issue. The escalation was both expected and dangerous. Master Bowmont's response to the message had been exactly what she'd anticipated: fear leading to overreaction, systematic questioning, increased security measures that would make normal plantation operations more difficult for everyone. But the involvement of colonial militia suggested that Sheriff Broussard was treating the incident as potential evidence of organized resistance, which could lead to arrests, interrogations, and punishments that extended far beyond the plantation's boundaries. "They're questioning people in the main house," Marie reported quietly. "Started with the domestic staff, then the senior field workers. Working their way through everyone who has any access to keys or detailed knowledge of routines." "What kind of questions?" "Everything. Where people were last night, what they know about security arrangements, whether they've noticed anyone acting suspiciously or asking unusual questions." Marie paused. "And they're asking specifically about you." The information was sobering but not surprising. Master Bowmont's notes had identified her as someone with family connections to previous security incidents, someone whose background warranted careful monitoring. Under the current circumstances, that background would make her an obvious subject for detailed investigation. "What specifically about me?" "Your movement patterns, your work history, your relationships with other workers, whether anyone has seen you in areas where you weren't supposed to be, especially during evening hours." This was the critical test of her 2-year preparation. If anyone had observed her nocturnal activities, if anyone had noticed the material she'd been gathering, if anyone had developed suspicions about her true intentions, the investigation would quickly focus on her as the primary suspect. But if her careful attention to operational security had been successful, if her appearance of broken submission had been convincing, if her systematic planning had anticipated this exact scenario, then the investigation would find nothing that definitively connected her to the previous night's activities. "Have they questioned you yet?" "This morning. Basic questions about my observations of plantation routines and whether I'd noticed anyone behaving suspiciously." Marie's voice carried a note of dry humor. "I told them that everyone behaves suspiciously when they're exhausted and frightened, so unusual behavior is hard to distinguish from normal behavior." "And their response?" "They wrote down my answer and moved to the next question." "I don't think they know what they're looking for, exactly. They're hoping someone will volunteer information or accidentally reveal something incriminating." The afternoon proceeded with work continuing under increasingly oppressive surveillance. Guards rotated positions every hour, questioning workers during brief breaks, examining work areas for anything that might represent evidence of security breaches or resistance planning. Adaeze worked steadily, maintaining the appearance of someone whose primary concerns were completing assigned tasks and avoiding any behavior that might draw unwanted attention. When guards approached her station, she answered their questions with the same polite deference she'd shown Master Bowmont during their conversation weeks earlier. Respectful, slightly nervous, eager to avoid trouble. "You work cleaning detail here every morning?" "Yes, sir." "Ever notice anyone in this building who shouldn't have been here? Anyone asking questions about equipment or keys or security arrangements?" "No, sir. I try to focus on my work and avoid noticing things that aren't my responsibility." The answer was perfect, because it positioned her as someone whose survival strategy involved deliberate ignorance of anything that might be dangerous to know. Guards conducting security investigations appreciated workers who minded their own business and avoided curiosity about sensitive matters. As the afternoon wore on, it became clear that the investigation was producing limited results. Too many people had potential access to information about plantation routines. Too many workers moved through areas where they might observe security arrangements. Too many individuals possessed the intelligence and capability to plan and execute the previous night's operation. Master Bowmont's systematic management approach, which had seemed so comprehensive when applied to controlling enslaved people, proved less effective when trying to identify which of those people had turned his own methods against him. But Sheriff Broussard was persistent, and his investigation was beginning to focus on a different approach. Rather than trying to identify the specific individual responsible, he was looking for patterns of behavior that might indicate organized resistance activities. The thing about incidents like this, Adaeze heard him telling Master Bowmont during their late afternoon conference on the main house gallery, is they're rarely isolated actions by isolated individuals. Someone with the knowledge and capability to breach your security arrangements probably isn't working alone. You think there's an organized group. I think someone has been conducting surveillance of your operations for an extended period, and that kind of systematic observation usually requires coordination and support from others. The conversation was audible from the boiling house, and Adaeze realized that Sheriff Broussard was intentionally speaking loudly enough for workers to hear. He wanted people to understand that the investigation was expanding beyond the specific incident to encompass potential resistance networks, potential collaborators, potential threats that might not yet have revealed themselves. The psychological pressure was considerable, but it also revealed important information about Sheriff Broussard's investigative approach. He was casting a wide net, hoping to catch not just the individual responsible for the security breach, but anyone who might be connected to resistance activities more generally. That approach made him more dangerous than Master Bowmont, whose thinking remained focused on systematic management of individual security risks. Sheriff Broussard understood that resistance could be collective, organized, supported by networks of people who shared information and coordinated activities across multiple plantations. As evening approached and the day's work concluded, Adaeze realized that the investigation had entered a new phase. The broad questioning and general intimidation were giving way to more targeted surveillance of individuals who had been identified as potential security risks or resistance leaders. Tonight, she would need to be even more careful than usual. Tonight, the systematic observation that had protected her planning for 2 years would need to expand to include Sheriff Broussard's investigation methods, his surveillance capabilities, his network of informants and collaborators. The real game was just beginning, and the stakes were no longer limited to balancing the books on a single plantation. Sheriff Broussard's involvement meant that success or failure would ripple across the entire colonial structure of Saint-Domingue, affecting not just the enslaved people of Chateau Bowmont, but potentially hundreds of others who lived under similar systems of systematic oppression. The indigo cloth pressed against her skin as she prepared for another night of careful observation and patient planning. Her father's death had created a debt that required payment, but that payment had to serve a larger purpose than personal satisfaction. It had to demonstrate that systematic management worked both ways, that those being managed could learn to manage their managers with equal precision and considerably more justice. The hunt was intensifying, but Adaeze had spent 2 years preparing for exactly this moment. Now she would discover whether her preparation had been sufficient, or whether Sheriff Broussard's experience and resources would prove superior to her patience and planning. Either way, the books would be balanced before this was over. The slave quarters after dark had taken on the atmosphere of a place under siege. Additional guards patrolled between the buildings at irregular intervals, their footsteps deliberately loud on the packed earth paths. Conversations were conducted in whispers that barely disturbed the humid night air, and even those whispers ceased entirely whenever the guard's lantern light became visible through the small windows. Adaeze lay on her mattress, listening to the changed rhythms of night sounds around her. Marie's breathing was too controlled, too measured, the breathing of someone feigning sleep while remaining fully alert. Celeste shifted position every few minutes, small movements that suggested anxiety rather than normal sleep restlessness. Even young Esperanza, who usually fell asleep immediately after the day's exhausting labor, remained awake and listening. The investigation had created fear, but it had also created something else. A heightened awareness that connected the quarter's residents in a way that hadn't existed before. Everyone understood that they were all potential suspects, all possible targets of Sheriff Broussard's expanding inquiry. The shared vulnerability had dissolved some of the careful distances that people maintained to protect themselves from the dangers of too much trust. But shared vulnerability could also create shared risk. If Sheriff Broussard was as skilled as he appeared to be, he would look for exactly this kind of change in community dynamics, would interpret increased solidarity as potential evidence of organized resistance activities. A guard's footsteps approached their building, paused outside for longer than usual, then continued toward the next row of quarters. Adaeze heard Marie's breathing shift slightly, a tiny change that meant she had also noticed the extended pause and was calculating what it might signify. When the footsteps had moved sufficiently far away, Marie whispered words so quiet they could have been mistaken for normal sleep sounds. "They're watching this building more closely than others." "Notice that too," Celeste responded at barely audible volume. "Could be random, could be systematic." Adaeze kept her own voice pitched at the same level. "Either way, anyone who needs to move tonight should reconsider." The exchange contained multiple layers of meaning. On the surface, it was simply acknowledgement of increased surveillance and a general recommendation for extra caution. But it also served as communication about whether the previous night's operation had compromised their ability to continue resistance activities, and whether additional actions should be postponed until the security situation stabilized. Movement might be possible, a new voice added from the far corner of the building. Baptiste, whose scouting experience had made him their expert on navigating hostile territory, but only for someone with very specific knowledge of patrol patterns and guard positioning. "Too risky for most purposes," Marie replied, effectively ending any consideration of collective action while leaving open the possibility that individual operations might still be feasible under certain circumstances. Adaeze processed this information while maintaining the appearance of someone drifting toward sleep. The consensus was that group activities were too dangerous, but individual actions by people with appropriate skills remained possible. That meant she could continue her own work if necessary, but she would be operating without backup or support from the others. More footsteps approached their building, but these moved with different rhythm and purpose. Adaeze recognized the gate immediately. Sheriff Broussard, conducting a personal inspection of the quarters rather than delegating the task to guards or overseers. His presence at this hour suggested several possibilities, none of them encouraging. He might be looking for evidence of late-night meetings or resistance planning. He might be conducting random intimidation visits to maintain psychological pressure. Or he might be following up on specific intelligence that had identified particular buildings or individuals as warranting closer observation. The footsteps paused directly outside their building. Through the thin wooden walls, They could hear Sheriff Broussard speaking quietly to the guard who accompanied him, but the words were too muffled to understand clearly. Then came the sound that made everyone's breathing stop entirely, the door's wooden latch being lifted. Sheriff Broussard entered the building with a lantern that cast harsh light across the small interior space. Behind him, the guard remained positioned in the doorway, blocking any possibility of escape. The sheriff's eyes swept the building methodically, taking note of sleeping arrangements, personal possessions, anything that might provide information about the relationships and activities of the people who lived here. "Good evening, ladies," he said, his voice carrying the false politeness of someone who held absolute power over their circumstances. "I apologize for the disturbance, but recent events have made it necessary to conduct more thorough security inspections." None of them responded. Protocol in such situations was to remain silent unless directly questioned, to avoid any behavior that might be interpreted as resistance or disrespect. Sheriff Broussard moved through the small space, examining sleeping areas and personal belongings with the systematic attention of someone conducting a professional search. When he reached Adaeze's mattress, he paused longer than he had at the others. "You're the one who works cleaning detail in the boiling house," he said. It wasn't a question. "Yes, sir." "The work requires you to arrive before dawn every morning." "Yes, sir." "Which means you're moving through the plantation during the hours when most people are asleep." He knelt beside her mattress, positioning himself at eye level. "You see things that others might not see, notice things that others might not notice." The observation was delivered as fact rather than inquiry, but it clearly required some form of response. Adaeze chose her words carefully, maintaining the balance between cooperation and self-protection. "I try to focus on my work, sir. Early morning is the best time to avoid distractions." "Admirable focus. But surely you notice when things are unusual, when people are present who shouldn't be present, when activities are occurring that don't match normal routines." Now they were approaching the real purpose of his visit. Sheriff Broussard wasn't conducting a general security inspection. He was following up on specific suspicions about her morning activities, possibly based on information from other workers or from his own observations of plantation routines. "I have noticed increased guard presence recently, sir. More patrols, more security measures." It was a deflection that acknowledged his question while redirecting attention toward official security activities rather than any potential resistance operations. The answer also positioned her as someone whose observations were limited to obvious, sanctioned activities rather than hidden or subversive ones. Sheriff Broussard smiled, but the expression conveyed assessment rather than warmth. "Indeed, we found it necessary to increase security in response to recent incidents. Tell me, what do you know about keys?" The question arrived without warning, designed to provoke an unguarded reaction that might reveal more information than a carefully considered response. Adaeze kept her expression neutral while her mind worked to interpret what Sheriff Broussard might know and what he was trying to confirm. "Keys, sir? Access to locked areas of the plantation, storage buildings, equipment rooms, the main house. Who has keys, how they're secured, whether anyone has observed unauthorized access to key rings or locked spaces. I know that keys are kept secure by Master Bowmont and the overseers, sir." "I have never had access to keys for any locked areas." "But you've observed how keys are used, how they're stored, how access is granted for legitimate purposes." "Only in the most general way, sir. When overseers unlock buildings for work assignments, or when maintenance requires access to equipment rooms." The exchange was a careful dance around the central question of how someone had gained access to Master Bowmont's private quarters. Sheriff Broussard was probing to determine whether she possessed detailed knowledge of key security arrangements, whether she had observed vulnerabilities in the current system, whether she might have had opportunities to copy or steal keys during normal work activities. "Have you ever been inside the main house?" Here was the trap she had been expecting. Sheriff Broussard knew about her brief period of domestic service, knew that she had been inside the house during the time when she might have observed security arrangements or gained access to Master Bowmont's personal items. "Yes, sir. Briefly, about 2 years ago. I was assigned to domestic service for several days." Why was that assignment terminated? I was not well suited for housework, sir. I made mistakes and was reassigned to field labor. What kind of mistakes? The questions were becoming more specific, more focused on details that might reveal information about her capabilities and motivations. Sheriff Broussard was building a profile, trying to determine whether her official record of incompetence and early termination from domestic service was accurate, or whether it concealed more complex factors. I became lost in the house corridors, sir. I was unfamiliar with the layout and the routines. I was found in areas where I should not have been. Which areas specifically? Near Master Bowmont's study, sir. I was trying to find my way back to the servants' quarters, but took wrong turns in the hallways. It was a careful admission that confirmed Sheriff Broussard's existing knowledge, while framing her presence in that hallway as confused wandering rather than deliberate intelligence gathering. The explanation also reinforced the impression that she was someone whose failures were due to limitations rather than capabilities. Sheriff Broussard made notes in a small book, his handwriting as precise as Master Bowmont's, but somehow more threatening because it represented colonial law enforcement rather than plantation management. When he finished writing, he stood and prepared to continue his inspection of the other buildings. "One final question," he said, turning back toward her. "In your opinion, who on this plantation would possess the knowledge and capability to breach Master Bowmont's security arrangements?" The question was designed to elicit either useful intelligence about potential suspects or revealing information about her own understanding of security vulnerabilities. Either response would serve Sheriff Broussard's investigation, but only one would serve her need to deflect suspicion while protecting others who might be at risk. "I wouldn't know how to judge such things, sir. Security arrangements are beyond my understanding." "Perhaps. But everyone develops opinions about who among their fellow workers is particularly intelligent, particularly observant, particularly capable of complex planning." Adaeze let several seconds pass before responding, as if she were giving the question serious consideration while struggling with the difficulty of making such assessments. "Most people here are focused on survival, sir, day-to-day survival. I don't know anyone who seems to think much beyond completing assigned work and avoiding trouble." It was a deflection that avoided naming potential suspects while subtly reinforcing the impression that the slave quarters contained broken people whose capabilities had been reduced to basic survival functions rather than organized resistance planning. Sheriff Broussard studied her face in the lantern light, clearly evaluating whether her response represented honest assessment or deliberate misdirection. After a long moment, he nodded and moved toward the door. "Thank you for your cooperation. If you observe anything unusual, anything that might be relevant to our investigation, you'll report it immediately." "Yes, sir." He left with the guard, taking the harsh lantern light with them. The building returned to darkness, but the atmosphere remained charged with tension and unspoken communication about what the visit had revealed. After sufficient time had passed to ensure that Sheriff Broussard had moved to other buildings, Marie whispered a single word: "Targeted." She was right. The visit hadn't been a random security inspection or general intimidation tactic. Sheriff Broussard had come specifically to question Adaeze, had prepared specific questions designed to test her knowledge and capabilities, had been evaluating her responses for evidence that she might be involved in the security breach. The investigation was focusing on her as a primary suspect, which meant that all future actions would need to account for increased surveillance and scrutiny. But it also meant that Sheriff Broussard's investigation was following predictable patterns, was making assumptions based on official records and conventional thinking about resistance capabilities. He saw her domestic service assignment as a potential source of intelligence about security arrangements. He understood that her early morning work schedule provided opportunities for observation and movement. He recognized that someone with her background and access might possess the knowledge needed to breach Master Bowmont's private quarters. What he didn't understand was that she had been planning for exactly this investigation, had been preparing for exactly these questions, had been developing exactly the responses that would deflect suspicion while preserving her ability to complete the work that still remained to be done. The books were not yet balanced. Justice had been served notice, But justice had not yet been delivered, and Sheriff Broussard's investigation, for all its systematic thoroughness, was about to discover that the most dangerous kind of resistance was the kind that looked exactly like submission, that moved like water through stone, that accumulated power so gradually that its true force remained hidden until the moment it finally broke through. That moment was still coming. Act 6. The Reckoning. 3 weeks had passed since Sheriff Broussard's late-night interrogation, and the plantation had settled into new rhythms that accommodated the permanent presence of additional security. Guards now maintained positions at all major work sites during daylight hours. Evening patrols had been systematized, with routes and timing designed to ensure that no section of the plantation remained unobserved for more than 15 minutes at a time. And most significantly, a network of informants had been established among the enslaved population, people who reported suspicious activities or conversations in exchange for slightly better food rations and reduced work assignments. The changes represented everything that Sheriff Broussard had hoped to accomplish through his investigation. Potential resistance activities had been suppressed through increased surveillance and enhanced security measures. The slave quarters had been penetrated by colonial authority through informant networks that made private communication dangerous and collective planning nearly impossible. And the person responsible for breaching Master Bowmont's security had been contained, if not definitively identified, through targeted pressure and systematic monitoring. But Sheriff Broussard's success in implementing these security improvements had created an unexpected problem. The investigation itself was consuming resources that could not be sustained indefinitely. Additional guards required payment, informant networks required management and compensation, and the heightened state of alert was affecting productivity across multiple plantations in ways that threatened to reduce the profitability that the security measures were designed to protect. Colonial authorities had begun asking pointed questions about when the investigation would conclude and normal operations could resume. Master Bowmont was fielding complaints from neighboring planters about the disruption to their own operations caused by borrowed guards and shared security protocols. Most importantly, the French merchants who purchased Saint-Domingue sugar were expressing concern about delivery schedules and quality control issues that seemed to be connected to security problems on the producing plantations. Sheriff Broussard found himself in the position of having successfully implemented comprehensive security improvements that were too expensive to maintain and too disruptive to continue. His investigation had protected the colonial system from immediate threats while creating longer-term problems that might prove even more damaging than the original security breach. Adaeze had been observing these developments with the same systematic attention she had brought to studying Master Bowmont's routines, and she recognized that the current situation was unsustainable. Sheriff Broussard would soon be forced to either conclude his investigation with definitive results or scale back security measures to levels that could be maintained long-term without compromising plantation profitability. Either outcome would create opportunities for someone patient enough to wait for the right moment. The sugar harvest was nearing completion, which meant that work schedules would soon shift from the intensive demands of processing fresh cane to the routine maintenance tasks that carried the plantation through the dry season. Fewer workers would be needed for daily operations, which typically meant that some enslaved people would be sold to other plantations or rented out for temporary work assignments. The disruption of established relationships and routines could provide cover for actions that would be impossible during normal periods.